All right, so I'm going to begin today by thanking Linda and the Provost and thanking you all for being here today. The title of my talk has gone through many revisions, and it currently is Read, Write, Assimilate, the Crises of Literacy Narratives in English Composition. And so I'm going to talk for about maybe about 50 minutes, and then afterwards we can have some questions. Okay. As a composition teacher and researcher, one of the questions I'm most commonly asked by colleagues in other disciplines is why, after taking required introductory composition courses, students often continue to struggle intensely with writing. The answer I give is simple. Learning to write is a process, and it is unlikely to be mastered by taking 1 or 2 composition courses. Most educators are inclined to agree with this response. And it is one that compositionists like me often rely on to explain the work of our field. What we do is introduce students to habits of writing, how to read, annotate, and respond to challenging academic texts, how to compose and revise multiple drafts of an essay, and it is by practicing these habits in a variety of contexts, both in and outside of the composition classroom, that students develop their craft. One of the questions I'm frequently asked by students taking composition classes is why the process of writing feels like some kind of medieval torture. The answer I give to this question is neither simple nor satisfactory. Writing is a messy process. When it doesn't seem to be going well, it can feel about as fun as a root canal. But when it does go well, it can feel about as exhilarating as jumping out of an airplane. Not that I've ever tried that, but it makes me sound interesting. In both instances, I have found that the only effective way to address these questions is with transparency. It isn't useful to gloss over the truth. There is no comprehensive instruction manual or rule book that one can memorize in order to produce so-called good writing. In fact, there is no empirical, absolute, or universal consensus on what good writing even is. Good writing is a cultural value passed down from one generation to the next. There are hundreds of writing handbooks, instructional guides, grammar drills, and checklists telling students how to write, but studies conducted on writing pedagogy conclude that what works for one student may be meaningless to another. And the only way to make effective writing habits stick is to practice the craft, to write through the feelings of anxiety, frustration, and joy. These questions posed by colleagues and students alike arise from the deeper complexities of what it means to be literate, or what literacy is. Literacy, broadly defined as the ability to read and write, is not something one acquires in an instant. It too is a process, one that is messy and exhilarating, sometimes both at once. Literacy, also commonly and more generally described as language acquisition, is much more than an abstract concept that shapes the field of education. It is a term often paired with skill, and when we talk about teaching or acquiring literacy skills, there is a subtle implication that these skills have a tangible or material quality. This also applies to literacy across disciplines. For example, scholars often talk about developing skills that promote scientific literacy, or familiarity with the discourses of social sciences and the humanities. Literacy is understood as something that transforms individuals. If one acquires language and develops literacy skills, this person is said to be literate. Literacy, thus, alters or affixes itself to one's identity. A person becomes literate. A student is literate. It is constructed as an aspect of one's very being. Within composition studies, analyzing the term literacy has proven to be a useful practice. It enables a richer understanding of how and why literacy is enmeshed in political systems and discourses of morality. In popular storytelling, from parables and plays to novels and films, literacy is constructed as a building block to success, an anchor that keeps the American dream afloat. Literacy is often regarded as a tool to uplift the oppressed and the downtrodden. It has a direct impact on one's ability to contribute to the greater good of society, employment, self-sufficiency, citizenship, and even character. This Uncle Sam image is, of course, a parody that is critiquing the relationship between US citizenship, monolingualism, and the supremacy of the English language. This image is intended to satirize what it means to be American, but it can easily be co-opted towards xenophobic ends. Some of you may recall the 1989 episode of The Cosby Show titled No Way, Baby, where Sammy Davis Jr. made a guest appearance as the illiterate relative of Dr. Cliff Huxtable's patient. It is Cliff's wife, Claire, who suspects this character is illiterate, in part explaining why one-on-one interactions with him have proven to be so difficult. One lesson that ties this episode together addresses the profound challenges illiteracy can present to people and their families. It is not insignificant that Sammy Davis Jr. was nominated for an Emmy Award for his portrayal of this character. What plots such as this Cosby Show reinforce, or this episode of The Cosby Show reinforce, is the idea that literacy leads to success while illiteracy leads to adversity. And generally speaking, few would be inclined to argue against this notion. The plot of how literacy transforms the life of an individual is taken up by compositionists who refer to these stories as literacy narratives. And here are some examples of how these narratives are defined in the field. What we call literacy narratives are those stories, like Bernard Shaw's Pygmalion, that foreground issues of language acquisition and literacy. Literacy narratives sometimes include explicit images of schooling and teaching. They include texts that both challenge and affirm culturally scripted ideas about literacy. At the most basic level, the plot of a literacy story tells what happens when we acquire language, either spoken or written. Literacy narratives often appear as sections or chapters within longer, well-known literary works, ranging from plays and novels to memoirs and biographies. The narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass circulates as a popular example of a literacy narrative. In his book, Douglass describes the profound impact literacy had on his life. Here is a brief excerpt from chapter 6. Douglass describes the process of acquiring reading and writing skills. He writes, "Very soon after I went to live with Mr. and Mrs. Auld, she very kindly commenced to teach me the ABC. After I had learned this, she assisted me in learning to spell words of 3 or 4 letters. Just at this point of my progress, Mr. Auld found out what was going on and at once forbade Mrs. Auld to instruct me further, telling her, among other things, that it was unlawful as well as unsafe to teach a slave to read." In composition courses where we teach students how to read and write about a variety of texts, it is not uncommon for instructors to introduce students to the genre of literacy narratives. For over 2 decades, scholars and teachers have recounted the ways in which literacy narratives rouse dynamic opportunities for reflection, critique, and creative engagement. Research on literacy narratives took rise in the 1990s when this genre began to circulate in English, but more specifically in composition and rhetorical studies. This work emerged from the field's desire to address greater diversity, respond to multiculturalism, and to reflect upon the marginalization of ESL and MLL writers. I was introduced to literacy narrative assignments in 2005 when teaching in a basic writing program for the first time. Basic writing programs are often comprised of students who have historically been labeled and marginalized as minority, first generation, sometimes at-risk and remedial writers. In some instances, these are labels students have carried for years, becoming further sanctioned upon admission to college. These labels, basic and remedial, have themselves been scrutinized in the field, and debates about the appropriate term to use continue today. In these first-year courses, students are often asked to read published literacy narratives, many of which are written by minority authors. One example is the essay Public and Private Language by Richard Rodriguez, which many colleagues in the field have taught or considered teaching, as it frequently appears in first-year composition textbooks. In these texts, authors describe their personal struggles and successes with acquiring English literacy. In some writing programs, it is a common practice to distribute an assignment in which students are required to write their own narrative. Although the assignment guidelines for how to produce a literacy narrative will differ based on individual programs and instructors, the online Norton Field Guide to Writing offers a sample list of guidelines I'd like to show you here. Now, these are just some excerpts from the field guide. Choosing a topic. In general, it is a good idea to focus on a single event that took place during a relatively brief period of time. For example, and any early memory about writing or reading that you recall vividly, someone who taught you to read or write, a book or other text that has been significant for you in some way, an event at school that was interesting, humorous, or embarrassing, a writing or reading task that you found or still find difficult or challenging. Next, write about what happened. At the heart of every good narrative is the answer to the question, what happened? The action in a literacy narrative may be as dramatic as winning a spelling bee or as subtle as a conversation between two friends. Both contain action, movement, or change. Both contain action, movement, or change that the narrative tries to capture for readers. A good story dramatizes the action. Consider the significance of the narrative. You need to make clear the ways in which any event you are writing about is significant for you now. Write a page or so about the meaning it has for you. How did it change or otherwise affect you? What aspects of your life now can you trace to that event? How might your life have been different if this event had not happened or turned out differently? The common feature of literacy narratives is that they tell stories of language acquisition. Assigning these texts opens to explorations of our politically charged academic roles. As compositionist Beth Daniel writes, various narratives of literacy have influenced and continue to shape the images we in composition studies have of who we are, what we do, and how we do it. What captures my interest is that much of our scholarship regards literacy narratives as pedagogically transformative and emancipatory to the lives of students and teachers. My concerns deal directly with the ways in which we theorize and write about our use of these texts in the classroom. Composition pedagogues often embrace the production and consumption of literacy narratives with little to no focus on their limitations. Our field can afford to be more critical of the broader values these narratives reinforce. I question the extent to which these texts are enmeshed in the very institutional dynamics of inequality they promise to expose or challenge. I propose two main critiques for consideration. First, a trend in the research indicates that asking marginalized students to write literacy narratives can spotlight complex relationships between literacy acquisition and identity. This is often seen as emancipatory to the lives of students, and while that may be so, we remain invested in a romanticized view of literacy. Because literacy narratives tell a story about language acquisition, a closer look at this term itself is key in understanding how we theorize these texts. In narratives written by minority authors, literacy is tied to sacrifice, concessions, and compromise. For some, literacy is about both acquisition and loss, but readers place emphasis more heavily on the former. I advocate an alternative approach, one that shifts the conversation from acquisition and loss to a consideration of what literacy narratives do not and cannot reveal. Second, composition pedagogues write about literacy narratives in ways that sometimes exploit these texts. There is an imbalanced focus on what can be learned from minority voices, and this reflects broader post-colonial relationships of master and subject. My work draws parallels between coming out stories and literacy narratives in order to problematize these relationships. Coming out narratives tell nuanced stories of acquisition as well. They often entail personal stories of coming to identify, understand, accept, or reveal one's sexuality. Analyzing the tropes and conventions of coming out stories can bring new direction to literacy narratives. The word outing, as rooted in the expression coming out of the closet, is a term frequently used in situations where individual agency and consent are not actually present. I take up outing as a rich and complex term, and in doing so, I call for a close examination of the idea of consent. And you get to hear my Canadian accent every time I say the word out. Audience and methodology. My research is intended for teachers of composition and educators at large. It is also my hope that students join the conversation as a way to develop more collaborative pedagogies. I draw from examples of what we do in the classroom, sample student writing, and the theories researchers have put forward. Scholarly achievements and contributions. Published over a decade ago, Beth Daniels' work distinguishes between what she calls the grand and little narratives of literacy. Grand narratives reflect the overarching parables that tell us reading and writing are good, important skills that lead to personal betterment. There is an expectation, both tacit and explicit, that the grand narrative will construct a happy ending, a feel-good lesson about the transformative power of literacy. What has shifted in our research over time is a willingness to acknowledge and even endorse little narratives that complicate this feel-good lesson. According to Daniel, little narratives are useful for examining the specific ways in which literacy plays out. Taken as a whole, the little narratives argue that the relationship between literacy and oppression or freedom is rarely as simple as we have thought. Little narratives are rich sites of exploration, revealing what is sometimes an arduous, conflicted, even painful journey toward this happy ending. You may recall Professor Sonia Rivera-Valdez's beautifully crafted convocation address in which she described how books were instrumental to affirming her identity and changing her life. The story she told was a literacy narrative containing several vivid little narratives comprised of both strife and reward. After hearing this story, one might conclude that literacy was a driving power that led to transformation, but a closer look will illustrate that there was a series of transformative events, some painful and alienating as well. What Daniel's separation of grand and little narratives demonstrates is that by focusing primarily on the benefits of literacy, we risk overlooking or silencing underlying stories that are also important. In a recent article, Successes, Victims, and Prodigies, Kara Poe Alexander redraws our attention to the subject of literacy little narratives with a qualitative study performed using student writing. She offers coded analyses of the literacy narratives students produce. Alexander confirms that the literacy equals success story operates as a common master or grand narrative, but there are many complex little narratives within this larger framework. These little narratives are more artful, critical, and nuanced than the master narrative. Alexander identifies them as cultural narratives and codes them as stories of success, hero, child prodigy, literacy winner, victim, outsider, and rebel. Alexander's work illustrates that there are trends and patterns in the little narratives students produce. This work shows us that in the field, we are or have become more efficient readers of these little narratives. But the point is not to end by celebrating our discovery of little narratives. Rather, we must continue to interrogate the purpose these little narratives serve. They are not merely an antidote to the heavy-handed master narrative, literacy equals success. Nor is it useful to argue against the material benefits of acquiring language. Instead, I believe it is worth examining the gaps that remain in our research in order to reflect on and enrich our use of these texts. If little narratives have been useful for demonstrating what is acquired and lost, what then can be said about the stories that have no place? English literacy is often used to represent a standard American English. I've had several students tell me that they cannot write, and when I probe this statement, I find that students arrived at this conclusion based on ideas about so-called standard academic English. Many students compare their own writing to the conventions used in their assigned course texts, work by published authors. They often say things like, I don't have a good vocabulary and can't use big words, or I write the way I speak. Some students self-identify as users of dialect and vernacular, placing these discourses in opposition to proper English. In these instances, students have learned to equate the act of writing with a monolithic understanding of standard academic US American English. What this demonstrates is that definitions of acquisition are varied. Some English speakers, for example, might see literacy as learning to read and write, but not necessarily learning to speak. For others, it may mean speaking, reading, and writing. And as I've pointed out, for many college students, it means learning to read and write a kind of academic discourse, one that may feel alien to all of us who enter post-secondary education. The last point is one that David Bartholomew explores in his influential essay, Inventing the University. These distinctions are important to consider in the context of literacy narrative assignments that ask students to compose an autobiographical text. According to Morris Young, the literacy narrative offers minority writers a chance to participate in the common cultural script of American individualism and achievement. These writers are told they can participate by way of hard work and education. But the literacy narrative gives minority writers also an opportunity to subvert the story through their use of minority discourse. Furthermore, the racialized subject reconfigures the literacy narrative as a strategy for resisting appropriation by a dominant American culture. According to Young, American culture imagines a unifying narrative of citizenship through the use of naturalized discourse of standard English. The racialized subject then resists this notion by composing literacy narratives in which they are denaturalizing standard English. In this configuration, minorities can use the literacy narrative as a powerful tool of resistance and reappropriation. For some minority students, standard English is an inadequate medium. This is something Gloria Anzaldúa finds when writing about literacy and schooling in her own life. In her open letter to third world women writers, there are several moments of meta-narrative in her prose where she questions how even to convey her message using the printed English word. She writes, "It is not easy writing this letter. It began as a poem, a long poem. I tried to turn it into an essay, but the result was wooden, cold. I have not yet unlearned the esoteric bullshit, the pseudo-intellectualizing that school brainwashed into my head. It is worth asking what gets lost when students who live and communicate in multiple languages acquiesce to the perceived demands of academic writing. Our research has not raised this question. In fact, some work on literacy narratives identifies so-called self-translation as a key benefit to asking students to write their own stories. Mary Soliday advocates self-translation as a way to represent difference, but the idea of difference is not clearly defined. Likewise, the very idea of self-translation is ambiguous. Some students report that it is a challenge to compose or translate autobiographical narratives when they feel limited by the ideological strongholds of the English language itself. I should note also the tradition of feminist critique that has raised questions about using man-made language in struggles against patriarchy. And of course, there have been practical and reconciliatory responses to this concern. Anzaldúa offers a useful observation in her book, Borderlands. She writes, "For people who live in a country in which English is the reigning tongue but who are not Anglo, what recourse is left to them but to create their own language, a language which they can connect their identity to, one capable of communicating with realities and values true to themselves? We speak a patois, a forked tongue, a variation of two languages." While questions about translation are worth noting, they need not disarm us. Some educators argue in favor of encouraging students to integrate multilingual practices into their writing as a form of creative and scholarly expression. A current trend in our research analyzes the presence of Englishes in the space of a writing classroom. The concept of Englishes may also serve as a way to accommodate, open to, or legitimize some of the incommunicable threads of storytelling. With literacy narratives, I believe it is useful to acknowledge the presence of stories and experiences that may be untranslatable or uncomposable for that matter. This idea diverges from earlier concepts of code switching and code meshing. What I am proposing is a consideration of the uncodable. It may be interesting to see how the uncodable narrative functions in contrast to the coding schema we have here. The uncodable might function under the category other. Eldred and Morton add this caution. We have romanticized the power of education and internalized the fantasy that a flower girl can become a duchess through education. I believe these romanticized views overwrite the little narrative students produce and lead to tidy conclusions that in spite of everything that happens along the way, literacy equals success. In any case, the goal is not to position students as victims of this grand narrative. In fact, asking students to write literacy narratives may elicit a useful brand of resistance, one that manifests in savvy negotiation, leading to productive ends of patois and beyond. Alexander's findings illustrate that students are equipped with various sets of choices as they write. The extent to which students are conscious of these choices is unknowable, but that there are various possibilities is important. Those who endorse literacy narratives as pedagogically transformative tend to imagine the classroom as a space in which minority or marginalized students are invited and encouraged to tell their stories. It is, of course, possible that for some students, writing a literacy narrative may be an act of insurrection, or a chance to control their own story, perhaps to dispel assumptions or to join an academic conversation and participate in a meaningful way. Some students might even see this as an opportunity to invoke sympathy and exercise in crafting pathos. And they may be pleased to have a captive audience of peers and instructors. In these instances, what is taking place is a consensual outing of sorts, one where students consider their audience and make strategic choices about what to say and how to say it to readers who are obligated to listen. They consent to revealing or outing an aspect of their life. In a slightly more nuanced approach, some students may use this writing assignment as an occasion to downplay so-called difference. Their goal may be to disrupt assumptions that minority students inevitably struggle with literacy. In this case, we see another opportunity for savvy intervention, where students tell a literacy equals success story that assimilates their experience into more mainstream images of schooling and education. To achieve this, students might employ master narratives of darkness to enlightenment, and by doing so, coast under the radar, or to use terms that circulate in queer theory, this might be a way of passing or being stealth. The trope of dark to light has been both celebrated and rebuked. Post-colonial critiques of the savage to civilized trajectory are also useful to literacy narratives. Students who have a complex understanding of how marginalized status operates might appropriate tropes of darkness to enlightenment as a cunning satirical act. In class discussions, students sometimes admit to accomplishing versions of this. A former student once confessed to having written an assignment for another class in which he talked elaborately of his experiences in prison. These experiences, it turns out, were fictional, but he justified it by explaining that he knew the professor assumed black men were criminals, so why not give him the story he'd expect? Something he could tell his wife over dinner, quote, behind locked doors. The choice the student is making functions as a rhetorical masquerade. It demonstrates a critical awareness of status quo attitudes and perceptions. When students use satire like this, they consent to a sometimes farcical, absurd, fictional, perhaps even humiliating account. For after all, the joke is on the audience, not the author. Many students carry incisive critiques that could result in this kind of satire. We see evidence of this in the context of the classroom. Students will often and immediately identify when their peers use satire, responding in suit with laughter. On the other hand, some students may feel that it is insincere to approach writing with satire, so they choose not to employ this tactic themselves. What I am describing is a short list of choices students have on hand when writing. The goal is neither to construct students as hapless victims, nor is it to fetishize their sense of agency. Nor do I think it is productive to engage in a guessing game. We cannot know what we do not know about students' intentions. Does it really matter if a student intended satire or not? Will knowing this change the grade they earn? A common goal of composition courses is for students to reflect on the writing choices they make, but there is no absolute way to determine if these choices are situated in true, authentic life experience. And does this really make a difference? What if our students have us figured out and they are playing to our desires in the narratives they construct rather than fulfilling their own individual goals? According to Mary Louise Bewley-Meissner, student writers are likely to be more concerned with affirming their readers' beliefs than with presenting their own. Playing to an audience's desires can be a profoundly useful skill, and without doubt, a student's ability to do this may be their key to success in a system where they are earning grades that we assign. We are working within an educational framework that inevitably sets certain parameters around student agency. So can the literacy narrative writing assignment be as emancipatory as we have led ourselves to believe? Now I'd like to show you some brief excerpts from students' actual literacy narratives. Okay, so this first example, this comes from Alexander's article. This is Anna. In my opinion, literacy is a survival tool in our society today. As a whole, I have learned that literacy is ever-changing and moving forward. Everyone, rich or poor, can gain something from literacy. Literacy is extremely essential because it is the stone on which the people of the 21st century will expand on and further. Christy. I still continue to love to write, but my aspirations to become a writer drifted after starting high school for the simple reason that I felt like I couldn't really write what I wanted to write. I had to write about what was assigned. I couldn't just let my mind go free. The required course materials are what tore down my love for writing. Alexander codes this as a victim narrative. The first one was a success narrative. Shalicia. I can remember as far back when I was 4 years old running around my grandparents' house, not because I didn't want to get my hair combed. I was running around the house because I didn't have to go to school that year. I couldn't go to kindergarten due to my birthday being in December and school started in August. Alexander codes this as other, stating it is more of a memory rather than an experience with literacy. What matters is how and why an audience will read students' literacy narratives for satire or pedagogical gain. Wendy Bishop identifies 7 possible accomplishments of literacy narratives, including opportunities to critique education, explore diversity, and understand academic relationships and goals. Educators writing about literacy narratives often rely on tropes of enlightenment. Bishop writes, we tell stories in order to share, but that sharing can include self-learning, self-defining, and self-shaping, as well as entertaining, beguiling, and performing. We make and remake, calibrate and recreate. We move from one understanding to a new, more enlightened understanding. This statement embodies an idealistic view of what literacy narratives achieve. The responsibility of sharing is complex. The minority as pedagogue can appear, albeit deceivingly, to reverse or disrupt top-down models of instruction and institutional power dynamics. But it can also conjure a familiar scenario in which subjects must teach masters what they have had to endure in order to arrive at this moment. This is an archetypal relationship in which the subject imparts knowledge unto a well-meaning master, perhaps to raise consciousness, or maybe to absolve responsibility for a legacy of injustice. This relationship is reflected in Soliday's claim that students' stories of everyday life enhance their personal successes as writers in the university. These stories can also deepen their teachers' understanding of difference and shape their responses to today's competing versions of multiculturalism. When minorities tell and retell a literacy equals success story, it establishes and confirms perceptions of the model minority. The narrative upholds a minority experience that is palatable to the status quo, more desirable for mainstream public consumption. Model minority narratives fit an evangelical script in which the savior uplifts the savage, where the untamed other moves from darkness to enlightenment. The scenario of Savage as pedagogue, however, adds a twist to this script, but only to say that the minority can occupy one of two positions, subjugated in darkness or enlightened on a pedestal. Our work on literacy narratives can afford a closer examination of the pedagogical agendas at play. What are we trying to remedy or address? There is an exoticizing Orientalist quality present when analyzing student writing. Our research mines literacy narratives for difference, but difference is a loose term. Perhaps it would enrich our work to shift focus from writers' choices to audience expectations. And with this in mind, I advocate transparency in the literacy narrative assignments we give to students. Imagine, for instance, how a literacy narrative assignment might be received by students already positioned or labeled as a minority in an academic space. Certainly, any classroom activity, assignment, or interaction might kick up a student's anxiety, and we know this happens all the time. In fact, some would argue it is a rite of passage in the pursuit of a college education. So while this may be an important consideration for any college-level work, it is useful to note how the brand of storytelling literacy narratives calls for intersects the telling of coming-out stories. Coming-out stories are those in which lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer individuals disclose significant moments or describe the ongoing process of naming, understanding, accepting, revealing one's sexuality. They often share features with coming-of-age stories, although the focus tends to be on sexuality and gender. This genre radically changed the landscape for LGBTQ individuals and allies, giving voice to communities often barred from public involvement and cultural production. More recently, this genre has been critiqued for sanctioning a unidirectional journey from closetedness to liberation, and this trajectory carries cultural biases that permeate and shape larger scripts for social action and participation. For example, classic stories within this genre often describe the moment of coming out as liberating in some way. The very idea of coming out hinges upon language. There are many languages in which there is no direct translation for coming out. And so once again, the act of coming out becomes enmeshed in dominant practices and cultural values. This classic version of coming out is affirmed as a default script for self-love and validation, forcing other possibilities into the margins. In her 2012 article, The Classic Coming Out Novel, Lies Janu challenges some of these critiques. She argues that writers such as Audre Lorde, who shows the limits of privileging visibility, demonstrate also that one can use nonlinear structures that play around with chronology in their autobiographical narratives. Likewise, some students who are asked to compose a literacy narrative do so in subversive ways, and I have pointed out a few examples. But I would like to consider counter-coming-out narratives in which the writer's message may be, you can't know the space of my closet, you don't see it, you are not invited to see it, and thus you can't know what closet means to me. My research investigates the abstract space of the closet as a site of activity. This exploration may offer insight into the literacy narratives some students choose to produce. Literacy narratives and coming-out stories raise questions about consent. In narrating The Closet, Tony E. Adams explains that in order to come out, one must first somehow go in. He brings attention to the temporality of this movement or transaction. Eve Sedgwick points out the closet, or more specifically, the perceived silence of the closet, is worth examining. Closetedness itself is a performance, and it exists in a silence that accrues particularity by fits and starts. Closetedness functions in contrast to the cacophony around it, and thus it is an active space where a complex set of choices and reflections might be taking place. These choices include whether or when to come out, stay in, and examine how one arrived there to begin with. For Stephen Seidman, the closet is not a space in which passive victims are created, but instead, closeted individuals remain active, deliberate agents who make decisions about their lives and forge meaningful social ties, among other things. The closet often conjures a symbolic space of silence and darkness, but activity can take place in dark silence, even if it is invisible to the outside spectator or audience. Seidman suggests that it is perhaps more correct to speak of multiple closets, considering that the experience of closetedness may vary considerably depending on factors such as age, class, gender, race, ability, region, religion, and nationality. Referring to the closet as a singular object reifies an already limited view of what it means to come out. The closet is not merely some neutral vessel from and to which bodies move, for as Sedgwick points out, in the vicinity of the closet, even what counts as a speech act is problematized on a perfectly routine basis. More literally, the closet can be a site of storage for artifacts intended to costume or cloak one's body. Masquerade, silence, and darkness have vexed feminist debates on the practices of veiling and cloistering, debates that have also hinged upon colonial images of dark, oppressed subjects and enlightened, liberated saviors. These images have been contested within post-colonial feminist theories, and not unlike the closet, veiling and cloistering practices require close consideration about issues of agency and choice. Homa Hudfar's work describes the veil's dual resistance for Iranian women. When it was outlawed, many women put on the veil and symbolically rejected the state-sponsored gender ideology. But later, under Islamic law, compulsory veiling faced stiff resistance from women, including some veiled women, on the grounds that such a law compromised their democratic rights. Hudfar's analysis underscores a dangerous tendency to dichotomize agency and victimization. Along similar lines, Trinti Minha writes, "If the act of unveiling has a liberating potential, so does the act of veiling." These points can be applied to images of the dark closet and perhaps more pointedly to grander ideas of literacy acquisition, coming out and coming to a place of reflection, retrospection, and critical consciousness. To be clear, I'm not suggesting that closetedness is preferable to coming out. I'm cautioning against privileging certain practices at the expense or exclusion of others. Coming out stories also contain little narratives that are worth analyzing. According to Pamela Kahi, coming out is only the latest in a series of metaphors for the disclosure of the self. Getting personal, breaking silence, speaking up, coming out, these are the moral imperatives of our postmodern age. Literacy narratives, then, share with coming out stories a sense of movement or progression from darkness and silence toward enlightenment and insight, but they can also work to dismantle the notion that this is the only marker of progress. Some educators utilize a version of coming out assignments as a way to denaturalize heterosexuality, whiteness, and cisgender privilege. A common exercise is one that involves Peggy McIntosh's popular essay, Unpacking the Invisible Knapsack. Teachers will ask students to reflect on the privileges they have and do not have in relation to the points McIntosh makes. I have included an excerpt of some of these statements, and here's a short list. And these are used to determine what kinds of privileges one has and to what ends. Okay, so this is just a sample. I can, if I wish, arrange to be in the company of people of my race most of the time. I can go shopping alone most of the time, pretty well assured that I will not be followed or harassed. I can swear or dress in secondhand clothes or not answer letters without having people attribute these choices to the bad morals, the poverty, or the illiteracy of my race. I can do well in a challenging situation without being called a credit to my race. I am never asked to speak for all the people of my racial group. I can worry about racism without being seen as self-interested or self-seeking. I can take a job with an affirmative action employer without having my coworkers on the job suspect that I got it because of my race. I can be late to a meeting without having the lateness reflect on my race. I can be sure that if I need legal or medical help, my race will not work against me. I can easily find academic courses and institutions which give attention only to people of my race. I can expect figurative language and imagery in all of the arts to testify to experiences of my race. I have no difficulty finding neighborhoods where people approve of our household. Again, these are just a few examples from the list. There are specific contexts in which this kind of activity is effective. This list helps challenge academic communities to defamiliarize aspects of life that are sometimes taken for granted. So perhaps asking students to write literacy narratives can be framed as just that, an opportunity to defamiliarize some aspect of their lives. Realistically, however, these assignments do not inherently challenge the grand or master narrative of literacy, and perhaps this isn't necessarily the goal. To conclude, one might question why we don't jettison literacy narratives from composition curricula. The point is not to privilege certain kinds of writing while abandoning others. Instead, the work of compositionists is to begin a dialogue about the ways in which all writing we assign in the classroom serves multiple purposes and political ideologies. I am calling for acute sensitivity in how we theorize our teaching of these texts so that we can enact these changes in our pedagogical practice. Through unending self-reflexivity, we might find ways to enrich our classroom instruction, value literacy narratives as scholarly forms of writing, and anticipate the challenges students may face. One of Alexander's pedagogical recommendations is to make the 7 little narratives more explicit to students, which I see as a useful approach. Those are the 7 narratives on her coding schema. She also suggests having students read their own work for these narratives as a way to encourage self-reflective writing practices. I would extend this recommendation, suggesting that we foster discussions about the arrays of choices available to each writer. Our job is not to be tacit, nor is it to bombard or overwhelm students with top-down instructions on how narratives are shaped. The work we do instead can help generate any available means of building rhetorical argument and allow students to be creative. I would also emphasize the value in exploring the terms master, counter, grand, and little narrative with our students. I add as a pedagogical recommendation that when composing a literacy narrative, students should be encouraged to consider their composing choices as performance. Instructors can re-envision performance as a tool for leveling or renegotiating an uneven playing field, one in which some students cannot gloss over their multiple or intersecting identities. Literacy narratives and coming out stories are not mutually exclusive kinds of writing, and in fact, for many of us, race, class, gender, sexuality, ability, religion, nationality, and so on, and access to literacy are inseparable, even though we are often expected to speak from one standpoint in a given context. If, when assigning literacy narratives, teachers do not explicitly ask students to talk about their race, class, gender, and so on, and I am not suggesting we should, perhaps it is worth mentioning that our intersecting identities may indeed enter the stories we tell. This point, though obvious in a way, may serve as an advance notice, a considerate caution for students. We can encourage students to prepare adequately and arm themselves against revealing information they deem private or personal. Likewise, we can open up lines of discussion around the nuanced differences between the private and the personal, especially in the context of writing autobiography that will be read by others. Connecting analytic discourses of coming out stories and literacy narratives may free us from having to choose, privilege, or perform certain identities and narratives at the expense of others. And this may even enrich the stories we tell by allowing us to perform and write from interconnected identities rather than artificially distilled ones. Thank you.
Isn't the term minority problematic?
It is, yeah. It's always, whenever I write it, it's in scare quotes. It has been very interrogated by the field already, and it comes with a long list of other things. I think some of the ones that I mentioned to you were at risk, remedial. I mean, these are all terms that are frequently problematized in the field. And sometimes it refers to students who are first-generation college students. Sometimes there are many of those things, and these are labels that, as I mentioned, they get sanctioned upon admissions to college. So minority is, in and of itself, a problematic term. What do we mean when we use it? Who are we referring to? And sometimes we're talking about race, sometimes we're talking about class. I mean, there's many different intersecting identities that come into play here. So there's a lot of scholarship on this particular subject.
But I'm wondering if you are going to deal with that in your work.
Yes, Yes, I do. I do deal with that, but then there's also this kind of, this is where we are in the field, so we're moving forward from this point. So Yeah.
A question on the comment, and the comment picks up on that. And I think that the minority issue becomes even more complex if you have an environment as you have in Miami, where the term minority is a misnomer. Because if you take account of the actual people there, you've got more minorities than majorities. So what does minority mean? And so I'm curious about, in the context of, let's say, a Miami or parts of LA, how complicated does it become to have the literacy narrative issue and the idea that literacy in English is the empowerment tool? But that's really a comment tucked onto a question. My question is there anything that suggests how media, particularly social media, is mediating the narrative, the literacy narrative challenge? And I'm thinking of Twitter, where the notion of full sentences, the notion of complete, correct speak is not the norm. How complicated is that technology mediation?
Yeah, that's a good question.
Next article you can do that.
Yeah. I'm not sure what, if people have examined the social media. Certainly it comes up in terms of just literacy studies alone, but not necessarily in relation to literacy narratives. And there is actually very little currently happening with literacy narratives on the field. There's just been this, recent sort of resurgence. But that would be an interesting thing to look at. And to respond to, I think what maybe Linda was starting to ask about, the term minority, Morris Young, who I referred to a couple times, actually has a very interesting take on what we can do with that term. And he suggests using the word minor rather than minority, because it, according to him, what the word minor does is it already, it vocalizes an already understood idea that certain people are infantilized by mainstream society, right? So he suggests that as an alternative term to minority. It hasn't taken on. I guess Ian? Tom?
Yeah, I thought that was really interesting, and I find that I'm finding a similar dynamic as I'm teaching research methods on the literacy, in the quote from Frederick implies empowerment on the one hand, but of course there's also indoctrination and sort of forced acculturation on the other hand. And I feel this as I'm teaching research methods, I feel like I'm opening students' ability to find cause and effect through experimental methods, but I also feel like I'm indoctrinating them into this particular point of view that's alien and has certain emotional, potentially political implications at the same time, and it's difficult to negotiate that territory. Have people tried, I'm thinking of some of the solutions to this for literacy narratives or for anything else. Is it sort of appropriate to say, when asking about literacy narrative, to what extent you felt both empowered and constrained, or oppressed, or unhappily transformed by literacy experience?
Yeah, absolutely. Yes, I think maybe not in such a direct way, but that is something that is encouraged, But then that gets read as, so when students do respond to that, sometimes it gets read in these ways that are kind of problematic, Oh, this is what it is for people of, your particular X, your race, your class, your gender, So, yeah. I think what you're describing, though, that anxiety of, what are you indoctrinating? What kind of research, how are these research methods indoctrinating students? I think one way that has worked for me is just to simply address that with the students, I think because they already have an idea and a sense of different kinds of writing and research for different audiences, so they know what they're doing in your class has a specific outcome, and there is a specific objective attached to that. So, I think they can really talk about that in the space of a class discussion, if you have the time in yours. Yeah. But I think it can only enrich writing to have those conversations. Tom.
Shereen, thank you. I enjoyed it. I was a little bit late, but I also want to, in addition to saying thank you for your talk, to follow up on the Provost comment about social media. Number one, self-promotion. Tomorrow we're having a journalism program talk about social media and journalism in 2M05. Just drill right down 2 stories. And that may come up about Twitter's, it'd be a great theme to ask our guests, one of whom is from the CUNY Graduate School of Journalism, and another is a top editor at Vibe, another is from WNYC, New York Public Radio, and another is from Queen's Ledger, the effect on literacy. And I have a very simple answer, it might not carry that much weight, is that your tweet might be horribly abbreviated and have butchered language, but the link is to something that is brimming with fully expressed ideas. That's what I'm using Twitter for, so I can know when some journalism or media thinker at NYU has a comment that points to a blog, and the blog is written properly. And the link, maybe it's been put through Bitly, so it's even shorter. You know, tiny little link to fully, so in that way, the language in a horribly condensed tweet might actually lead you to something good.
Thank you.
Noon till 2. Thank you.
Charles?
Yeah, I was taken by the story of the African-American man who wrote the prison narrative. And it reminds me that often our students do come very well prepared to read us, but we are poor readers of our students. And one of the important things about handling, in my mind and in my teaching, about handling how we deliver this thing called literacy is to get an assessment of where our students are. Even the idea that we're indoctrinating may not be, it may be an assumption that we're making. Our students are adults when they come to us, so many of them have their political, their gender identification pretty much already set. And the degree which we think we can affect that might not be as strong as we imagine. But it'd be interesting for us to study ways to learn to read our students better, rather than just assume that, well, the assumption is that what we're teaching is something that they're accepting in some kind of monolithic way. But it would help us if we could understand them as well as they've been trained to read us.
That's where I think the field of writing pedagogy so nicely complements what is taking place in education research. Because I think we are finally opening that conversation to look at ourselves as teachers and to be, reflective of our own practices in a way that has primarily focused traditionally on students. They need to, us, they need to do this. And so now I think that that's a really interesting thing. And I think we've learned a lot from the field of education, and we're in a way very connected for that reason. Thank you.
Yeah,
Michael?
Thanks for a real challenging lecture. Do you think, well actually, do you see what is the difference, is there a difference between autobiography and literacy narratives for you? And so to what extent do you think literacy narratives actually are autobiographical?
They can be. But then sometimes people actually end up writing literacy narratives in biography also, where they're writing about another person's life. They'll talk about someone else's experiences with schooling and education. So a literacy narrative can appear in different kinds of texts. It's not only just a personal story, it can be an observation that someone else makes about a subject.
And is there, how would you characterize the difference between autobiography and literacy narrative?
Oh, I think many autobiographies contain literacy narratives within. So,
Black Boy.
that's a great example, actually. What I was thinking is, so I think a lot of times when people write an autobiography or a memoir, Alison Bechdel's Fun Home, I'd say that there's a whole chapter dedicated to her literacy narrative, where she's actually showing, this is a graphic novel, and she's actually showing us examples of texts she read as a small child that influenced her, her sense of identity, her ideas about her relationships to family members. I think a lot of times literacy narratives are embedded in autobiographies and memoirs as a way to tell one's life story. You know, usually schooling and education has had a somewhat prominent role in these authors' lives. That's why they're sitting down to write. Sometimes not. But then it does come out. But it usually is a thread or a section or a chapter devoted to that. It doesn't necessarily always dominate the whole text. So in that sense, I think that's where that generic distinction comes in. You know, a text devoted wholly to talking about schooling and education and literacy practices would be called a literacy narrative. A text that has little pieces of that might be called an autobiography or memoir. But there are literacy narrative threads within. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, why I ask is the way that autobiography is a sort of a more larger, as you're suggesting, realized definition of a self, and particularly when that self is posited as necessarily resisting, you know, the other part of your the schema that you laid out there, necessarily resisting some very fundamental kind of insult or invalidation. I'm wondering if there's I think Malcolm X's, you know, autobiography and his literacy narrative is interesting because he not only is it's kind of a lie. First of all, Malcolm was literate prior to
That's right.
you know, he was actually a very good student as a young man, and then but he and Alex Haley decided to put his prison literacy narrative as probably the most important fulcrum around which his autobiographical identity of a resistor to white supremacy is established. And so, and then he, in the last chapter of the book, he refers back to a kind of literacy when he says that I don't spend a moment of my time without some book in my hand that will help me to fight what, as he puts it, the white man has done to us. So I'm wondering if I say all of that to ask if there's a kind of a window into our understanding of our student literacy narratives through a theory of autobiography, and your talk just seems to be really dancing around the extent to which literacy narratives are implicitly and probably subconsciously being used by the students as a real form of resistance, a la an autobiographical identity. Is that too complicated?
They can be. I think that I would argue that they can be. Sometimes no. But yeah, absolutely. For some students, it is a form of resistance, and sometimes that reading is being overlooked too, for the sake of the greater good, the literacy equals success story. So once they've written that down, it's kind of like, okay, then you pass. But there is something much more complex going on, the site of resistance that you're describing.
Do we need to tap into that more? I'm actually not familiar with the
We've become much more proficient in our reading of little narratives. Those are the little narratives. They've been called little narratives. They're actually quite powerful narratives. So I don't know if little is really the right word, but we've become fairly proficient in reading that. I mean, that whole coding schema, 20 years ago that did not exist. Nothing like that existed. But so we're starting to see, like, okay, this is where the student is constructing themselves as a victim. This is where the student is constructing themselves as a hero. So I think we're getting better at that, but maybe not to the ends that you're describing or for the purposes that you're describing. The consequences are different, in a way less political, for obvious reasons.
I've got a comment and a question again. And the comment is related to something you said at the beginning, that writing is a messy process. And I think it's just stating the obvious that writing is a messy process not only for students, for professionals, for people like us who are in the business of writing. It is also sometimes not easy. It can become messy, especially if you've got the expertise which you're struggling with to capture that expertise in a way in which the world out there will read and understand, and you're trying to make the complex expertise you've got understandable. I just wanted to underscore that it's a messy process, not just for students, but for all of us, and that is just stating the obvious. But I want to go to something you said towards the end of your very good talk, and and that is the notion of narrative being performance. Does that mean that, let's say, creative performances, skits or plays, also are packaged as part of the narrative, literacy narrative package? I'm trying to distinguish between how to see a narrative as performance on the part of students, and whether plays and skits also could be considered part of the literacy narrative.
So I think there's sort of two ways that I would answer that. The first one is that when I'm talking about performance in texts, I'm talking about encouraging students to see that there's an audience for every context. And so you can choose what aspects of yourself you want to perform. And there's also this kind of, Dorothy Allison is really good on this, where she talks about blurring this fact and fiction binary, not for the sake of being deceitful, but as a way to really emphasize the fact that any story we tell, even if it is an autobiography or memoir, we are creating a fiction. And so there is a performance in that. There's a performative aspect to that fiction. And so that's kind of where I'm going with the performance side of literacy narratives. But I think plays and other kinds of performance arts do also sometimes contain threads of literacy narrative in them. Eldred and Mortensen did a study of Pygmalion. And My Fair Lady is based on Pygmalion. And so there is a literacy narrative in that, too. Yes, so.
Maybe just one more on the classroom part of this.
Sure.
What would you say to somebody who says, I refuse to teach I refuse to assign literacy narratives as student assignments for many of the reasons that the problems that you've identified there?
I think that's fine. That's a fine choice to make. I would say, okay. I would want to have a conversation about it, too. I don't necessarily assign literacy narratives as part of the first-year composition pedagogy, but it does come up sometimes. If students really connect to something they read, by Richard Rodriguez, for example, or that chapter out of Alison Bechdel's book that I'm describing, then I might encourage them to pursue this. But it's not necessarily something that I think needs to be done. But I also think what could be really useful is to look at the ways we can assign literacy narratives beyond the first-year composition level. Because a lot of times it becomes ghettoized as a kind of type of writing that only first-year students who are inexperienced college writers should or can do. And really, it's actually very sophisticated. And so I think we should encourage students at all levels to do it. And in fact, I wrote a literacy narrative for a graduate class that I took. And it was, a very worthwhile experience for me to be able to do that. So, I hope that answers your question.
Shereen, did
Yes,
you
hold
also interrogate the notion of literacy within a language? What is really literacy in a language? What are the different literacies within a given language? If you think, for example, of different genres of writing or of language, or different specialized discourses, which have sometimes their very own, not just grammar, but also vocabulary. So what is really this notion of, what is this really literacy? I remember, for example, when I was doing when I was getting back a manuscript, a book manuscript that was supposed to go for a certain audience, and I always thought of myself as a somewhat decent writer. Got back the manuscript from the copy editor, and virtually every page was layered in red. And I seriously started to question my ability to writing, and that's based on the market that the book was supposed to be marketed to, rewrite certain, large pieces of it, or accept what the layout editor gave me, as well as correct some of the things that he or she injected that have made things factually wrong. So I had to critically read the layout editor's editing as well. But so coming back, my question is really what does it mean within a given language, English, Chinese, whatever it may be. What is literacy there?
Yeah, I think for some it means simply the ability to read and write at what is referred to as, again, this problematic basic level. But then for others, it's coming to college and figuring out how to write in so-called academic discourse. So I think there's different layers to literacy and different ways that we encounter it and then feel literate and illiterate all the time. And students, talk about this. I talk about this with my students also in terms of, like mathematical literacy. I can barely add. I mean, I can add, but it's been a long time since anyone has asked me to add. But the thing is, does that make me illiterate in math? Or, is there something else? Is there a better term that we can use? I think that those are really good questions, and especially because we do need to think about literacy across the disciplines, right? So literacy is not just about reading and writing skills in English. It's also about scientific literacy. It's about literacy in the humanities, the other humanities, social sciences. There are certain discursive practices taking place in all of these different disciplines that demand a different accessibility to literacy.
I think literacy has more to do, less to do with actually reading and more to do with how you read. So that's why a literacy in a certain discipline will be different from in another. And I always think of the word discerning, like not just to read it, but what I also thought was missing is the thinking part of it. I don't know if that made any sense.
The thinking on the part of the students, or?
One of the problems is when people read things and they don't think about whether or not what they're reading is credible. So that person actually, to me, might not be literate because they're reading it maybe at face value and not thinking about the meaning. So to be literate, you need to be a discerning reader. I don't know if that...
Critical thinking.
And that means to have certain dispositions in your thinking. I don't know if this...
Critical thinking sounds like similar to what you...
Yeah.
Yeah.
If you're literate, you got to be critical.
Right.
I was actually thinking of that too, with respect to the like in slave narrative, literacy is the point, right? But now a lot of us are literate, but we still act like slaves. So what's do we still call ourselves literate? Therefore,
yeah.
Literacy with empowerment.
What's that?
Yeah.
Literacy without empowerment.
Yeah, right. Whereas for a slave, an enslaved African person, literacy by definition was a kind of empowerment.
There's a difference between reading words and making meaning of the words, and I think that's what you're getting at too.